Now, once in a while, you might have those thoughts. What if Jehovah's Witnesses are right? After all, when I turn on the news, I'm seeing things that I never thought I would see. Okay, war in Europe. I thought this will be beyond our lifetime. What about the other one in Israel? I mean, horrible things that are happening, and this is not the end. There's Yemen. There's other nations that are fighting, and there's really a lot of uncertainty and a lot of trouble in the world that maybe we're not expecting at this time. What if they're right? See, there is something called Pareidolia. I'm not 100% sure if I'm pronouncing this right. But what it is basically is when we start seeing patterns and connecting dots and making things, although they don't have anything to do with one another, but we're making the connections, saying this means that. We're seeing a specific pattern, recognizing it, and we're saying this is what I know it is. Now, let me ask you this to illustrate this better to you. What do you see on this picture? What did you see? Was that an eye or a sink? Sink. Look closer. What is it? Isn't it a drain to a sink? But what was the first thing you saw? It looked like an eye. At first glance, maybe that was the conclusion you came to. Uh, but if you look at it closely, or if you hear the explanation, what it really is, then you're like, oh, I see it now. But at first, it looked like an eye. This is how people see Jesus on a pancake and Holy Mary in the clouds and making the connections. I see the face on Mars and so on and on. Because we're making the connections, our brain is constantly looking for patterns, and we're always trying to make sense out of this world by connecting the dots, trying to say what is the cause and what is the effect. We see the effect, we automatically want to know what the cause is. We live in what we call a Newtonian world, where there is, for every action, there is equal and opposite reaction. If we don't know what the cause is, or when we see a result and the result doesn't make sense to us, there's something that happened and we can't logically explain it. The most common pattern that people did for thousands of years, they were creating supernatural sources. They would say, oh, I see lightning, I see clouds, I see thunder. And if you lived in that neighborhood at that time, guess what? There was Thor and the hammer and the lightning that came out of his eyes, and they had a perfect explanation of a supernatural source of what causes lightning and thunder. But the moment we figured out what it really means, what it really is, and that it's a natural phenomenon, Thor became a myth. Thor became obsolete. There is no need for Thor anymore. But see, when we're watching the news, our minds were programmed to look for specific pattern, although that pattern doesn't make a perfect sense, but there are some similarities of what they told us. Some similarities of what they told us to look for in case Jesus would come and return. One of those things was wars. Wars, famine, pandemics, and all those things supposed to be a sign of the end. But I tell you, please do yourself a favor. If you're still worried, if you're still thinking, if you're still trembling every time you're turning on the news thinking, what if Jehovah's Witnesses were right? What if Jesus is coming back? What if all those things will happen and the Great Tribulation is just around the corner? Do yourself a favor. Actually, pick up this book. Okay? Pick up the Bible and read the entire chapter of Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Read those 3 chapters, okay? And from very beginning until the very end. And you'll see how the cherry picking that happened in not only Jehovah's Witnesses, but I'm going to choose that example, cherry picking data of I'm going to read this scripture, I'm going to read this scripture, and this scripture matches, but that one doesn't really match. So we're not going to mention that one, right? When I read about wars, when Jesus said, when you hear about wars, you know the end is not yet. That doesn't mean the end is around the corner. That doesn't mean the end is close. It means it's not yet. And it talks about that there will be lots of people claiming to be Jesus, that there will be prophets, that there will be performing miracles, and we will be misleading even the chosen ones. but none of those things are happening, and none of those things we can point out, right? So we're just cherry picking data of what this means and what that means. Now, they basically took that chapter and divided into three, okay? Although it was one speech about the destruction of Jerusalem, because they were sitting in front of Jerusalem and they were talking about what is going to happen to this building. When Jesus said, oh, you know what? You see this beautiful building? See all those huge stones? Not one stone will be left upon stone. Okay. And then he talks about what? When you pray, pray that this doesn't happen on Sabbath. Interesting. He was talking to people who will be Christians after the law will no longer apply, after his death, and after Sabbath is no longer mandatory. He said, pray that it doesn't happen on Sabbath. I wonder how many Christians are actually praying that Jesus does not come back on Sabbath. Pray that doesn't happen on Sabbath. Pray that it doesn't happen in wintertime. Well, if it's global, winter on one side is summer on the other side of this earth, right? Pray that it doesn't. Pray for pregnant women, right? Run towards the mountains. So basically, what they did was they took some of the scriptures and they said, well, these scriptures, they only apply to the first century when Jerusalem was destroyed. And then some things, well, they will only apply towards Jesus' second coming, like Jesus flying on a horse and being seen by everybody, and the sun will not give its light and the moon will turn into blood, and his presence will be like lightning and every eye will see him. Well, that didn't happen yet. Jesus didn't return for the second time, so that will happen all at the very end when stars will fall from the heaven. Now, go figure it out. How can a star fall from the heaven? And if Jesus knew what stars were, why would he say the stars will fall from heaven? Even one star would evaporate the whole earth. So read it for what it is, and you'll see that they divided into three. One that happened in the first century, second that will happen in the Jesus' second coming, and the third section, which they say, well, it will be fulfilled a little bit in the first century, and it will also have a second fulfillment at the time of Jesus' second return, like maybe the wars or famines or pandemics and diseases and stuff like that, and evil people. So they basically cherry picking data. You can't call it any other way. But do yourself a favor and read one more thing. Go to Revelation chapter 2 and 3. This is the time when Jesus is approaching the people in different congregations. And he says, to this congregation, let's say Laodicea or Ephesus, he says, this is what I have for you. This is what I have against you. You got to fix this before I come back to you. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble. So he said this to 7 different congregations, which problem they had, and they had a very specific problem, and they had to fix this problem before he returns. Otherwise, they're going to pay the price. Now, not everybody had a problem. Some people just got a commendation, but regardless, he was addressing to those congregations and he said, I'm coming back to you. 2,000 years ago. He did not come back to those congregations. Those congregations are long time gone. Now you got to ask yourself, what is going on here? See, the Christians couldn't possibly say, oh, Jesus was lying. They couldn't possibly say, oh, Jesus was a false prophet. So they had to come up with some sort of understanding, as they call it, that would allow them to stretch all those scriptures into pretty much infinity. So they said, well, Jesus will come back, but nobody knows the day and an hour, and it will happen sometimes in the future. 100 years from now, 2,000 years from now, nobody knows. Maybe another 2,000 years, maybe another 10,000 years. Nobody knows. So they basically made it infinite. Well, except Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses didn't make it infinite because they just started putting dates on it. They said, well, Jesus did return already in 1914, invisibly, and they were the only ones that noticed it. And now we're just entering this phase of one generation. And then, of course, when their predictions of generation didn't come true, they started stretching, right? Stretching time of how long is the generation, to the point when there's literally what, 2 generations now, as they call it, contemporaries. It's weird. It's weird how people can see something black and white in front of them, and yet instead of admitting, oh, maybe we were wrong, and they will start coming up with very weird understandings. This is why I say that this religious pareidolia is really crazy. It's causing us to believe things just because we want to connect the patterns. When we connect the patterns, we feel smart. We feel like, oh, I know exactly what this is. And nobody else knows, but I know. Because we connected the dots. We connected the pattern. And this is what actually makes us smart. When I see a seed and I know exactly what kind of a tree will grow out of this. Okay? Somebody else will see, I don't know what it is. They don't connect the dots. They don't know what it is. They don't have enough experience and knowledge and skills to figure it out what will grow out of the seed. But when we see what was programmed into our mind on the news, then automatically we're falling for it, because that's how our mind was programmed. Do yourself a favor, read those chapters, and you'll see how these events were only told for the first century. And the things that didn't come true, why didn't it come true? Because they were expecting it, but Jesus did not return. There were many people who promised to return, many, and still today people are making the same promises, saying, "Don't worry, I will return," and they never do. Just like Jesus didn't return. I think, well, Jehovah's Witnesses believe that he did, just invisibly. I think it was Harold Camping also that believed that Jesus returned invisibly. I'll tell you another example of somebody who had that challenge. Somebody believed very strongly that our personality depends on the stars, right? Astrology. And they're like, oh, what sign are you in? Are you Cancer? Are you Virgo? Whatever it is. And they knew all those signs really well. And they're like, oh, if this is you were born on this date, therefore you have this kind of a personality. And they were so strongly convinced about this that when I challenged them on this theory, they completely couldn't even wrap their heads around this. They like, what are you talking about? Of course, it's proven. I'm like, well, I give you an example. My sister has twins, and they totally different. Their personalities are opposites in almost everything, and yet they were born minutes apart. My daughter was born a week before, I think 4 days before, and yet she's totally different than the twins. How is it possible? They're all technically born on the same stars. And she's thinking and thinking and thinking. And she says, well, because they have different names. And the name will also make an impact on your personality. And I'm like, oh my gosh. At this point, you just got to stop because there's no critical thinking whatsoever. And unless she's willing to start thinking critically, then she will start making those connections, making those dots, not because she's dumb or she's stupid. She just was trained by somebody else, okay, to recognize certain patterns, to recognize certain behaviors. And she thinks she's smart. She thinks that, oh, I'm connecting this dot. You behave like this because you were born on this date and because you have this kind of a name or whatever, right? Things that have nothing to do with your personality, nothing to do with who you are as a person, but there is a pattern, and she thinks she cracked the code. There's so many people like this, okay? And we're all biased. We all have our biases, and so do I, and so do you, because of our programming. Our mind, our subconscious mind is constantly being programmed. I'll give you an example. You walk into a room. Let's say you're a woman. You walk into a room, and there's 2 guys sitting on the table, and they're talking. And one guy you see and you're like, yeah, this guy is friendly, I like him. I didn't talk to him, but I have a good feeling about him, good energy about this guy, right? And the other guy's like, oh, this guy's a creep, I just feel it inside of me. I don't want to talk to him, I don't want to near him, whatever. You have no idea how these people are. You don't know how they are. You just claim to feel their energy, and you know right away one is a really nice guy and the other one's a creep. What truly happens, okay, is this. When you see the nice guy, the way he looks, the way he smiles, the way he's presenting himself, it reminds you of somebody you already like. He has a similar ear, he has a similar eyes, similar tone of voice. And the way he's presenting himself represents in your subconscious mind somebody you already like and feel safe and feel good about. And that's why you have the feelings towards this person. The other person that you feel, oh, this guy's a creep, is because the way he looks, his face, his facial expressions, his tone of voice, his gestures remind you of a person who maybe hurt you before. And your subconscious mind picks up on those patterns right away and thinking, I gotta protect myself from this guy because similar person in the past caused you pain. That's what your subconscious mind does. He's looking at everything around you and trying to figure it out whether this is painful or whether this means pleasure. And he wants more pleasure and wants trying to avoid pain. That's all what the subconscious mind does. And this is how it's being programmed all the time. You know what? A lot of people are reacting with fear. Understandably so. It was programmed into our mind to see that this whole world is belonging to the wicked one, that everything is bad and evil, because that's what it was told to us all the time. So we're constantly looking for the bad news. Almost the bad news was a good news, because we knew that if the bad news will happen, that means we are closer to the paradise. So we were anticipating, almost hoping for more bad news. Subconsciously, that's how it was programmed to us. The more things we heard, the closer the reward of paradise was in our mind. But truthfully, now that you're out of this, how do you look at the future? And believe me, it might not be easy, but if you look at what is really happening and what took place in the last century, it will give you a totally different perspective. We're living in extraordinary times. Do you know how many people were dying during World War II compared to the conflicts that are happening right now? Because on the news, you're gonna hear hundreds of people died today, and then the next day another 100, another 50 here dead. Horrible, horrible. During World War II, there were 1,000 people dying per hour. Per hour. And then there was a pandemic that killed more people than the World War II. During Cold War, everybody thought, oh, we're just going to die because of the nuclear weapons. We're training kids what to do in case of a nuclear bomb exploding. It was regular training in America. This was the reality. People thought that by the year 80s to 90s, the latest, we're going to run out of oil. We're going to run out of oil, and that's it. Our life will be totally disastrous, and people will fight again for resources, and there will be anarchy, and there will be another World War III fighting for oil. That never happened. And it seems like we have more oil today than when we were thinking back then that we're going to run out. See, people will always find a way. This is when fear kicks in. You know what I do? If anything stuck into my mind is that I actually started to have faith in people, because people will always find a way. It's amazing. You look at the history and you're looking at the time that we're living in today, and you'll see that people will always find a way. It might get worse, but then later on, it gets better. Everything is a season and everything changes. And we're going through a season, and the season might be a winter, but guess what? Every season comes and goes. There's always spring after winter. There's always day after night. Nothing lasts forever. There is no war that lasted forever. There's no pandemic that lasted forever. There's no crisis that lasted forever. No recession, no depression lasted forever. It's all a season. And we might be in one, we might be entering another, but it will always change. The only thing that never changes is the fact that always everything changes. So don't be afraid of looking into the future, because the things that are happening right now is just cyclical, and things will get better. And we'll come out of this, and we came out of a whole bunch of other problems before. We'll come out of this one as well. Have faith in people, because believe it or not, majority of people are good. They have good hearts. They don't want war. They don't want crime. They don't want evil things to happen to their families, their kids. They want to look at the future as something positive. And there's more of us than those who just want to see the world burn. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.